Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. I'm delighted today to have Guise-Gerrity, Guise-Gerrity, I'm so sorry, and Kate McLaughlin with me today. And they have been working on a project about the Maryland Kids Code and its effect on local media. So welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Tell us a little bit, please introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourselves and the project. And maybe, Kate, would you like to start?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So first, thank you so much for having us on. I'm currently a junior at Loyola, Maryland. I'm studying political science and journalism. I think the two are very, very related to each other. So it's been really interesting over the past 3 years looking at the intersection between them. And that's exactly what this project has proposed us with. In the winter, in the beginning of the spring, I was approached by my professor, Professor Guise-Gerrity, after she had learned about the passing or potential passing at the time of the Maryland Kids Code. And she was just interested in potentially exploring this and the implications it could potentially have on local media, journalism, how the bill was going to be functioning in general. And we've been having a lot of fun researching and looking at it ever since.
Terrific. So, Nina, is this a project that you kind of take on? I remember when we first talked about this potential bill, and it really does come at the intersection of privacy and journalism and sort of free speech and all these interesting topics that really fit into some of the coursework that you were doing. But do you normally kind of take up a topic like this and do a deep dive? Tell us a little bit more about you and how this fits into your work.
Certainly. Well, not to this degree, right? And so I will do that in my own research and my own writing. I might integrate some of this into a conversation in class, but I don't get the luxury of spending 9 months following this bill and figuring out where it came from inception and what are the different influences, right? That we'll talk about that came out of California and that came out of India, that came out of Britain. And I usually, quite honestly, I usually make sure that I have a really, really smart student who I can then say, hey, I have this great idea for us. Wouldn't this be fantastic? But I have to just genuinely want to work with you for an extended period of time. I also have to see you as mature and bright and something that also advances your base of understanding. So I don't do this often. This to me was a luxury and a treat.
Wonderful.
A lot of ways, right? So,
and what do you teach at Loyola? I know that you're a professor there. Let's just for the record, let's make sure everybody knows who you are.
Yes, absolutely. As they should. And so I've been now, I'm in my 21st year, but I teach philosophy. So I teach a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers. So we'll do the pre-Socratics and the basket of Socratic philosophers who we really utilize their practices and theories continuously throughout the day. My goal is that they can put a name to it and at least some ideas behind it. And then I also teach political and economic philosophy. So that takes a harder look at the way and the political implications of economic theory and economic theorists and how that then becomes part of political law. In that, we study John Stuart Mill and his theories of utilitarianism and liberty and censorship. So that's why hearing about this bill became fascinating to me. Also because I work with students and I work with young students in different capacities and in service. The role that social media is playing in their lives is for some it's interesting, for some it's like weeds that just keeps growing and infecting them. And what does that look like coming forward, I think, for students? Mm-hmm. So that's what prompted my interest.
Well, let's take a step back and talk about what the Maryland Kids Code bill does and sort of what its aims were. And you all did a lot of work sort of looking at the origins. So set the context for us.
Sure. you want to start?
Yeah, so the Maryland Kids Code, the absolute goal is for the information to be handled responsibly that is taken in by larger corporations. It's about protecting vulnerable populations. So this bill specifically looks at people that are under the age of 18 and also specifies specifically under the age of 16 too. And it's looking at people that are on social media whose data could potentially be sold and is being sold, and how we can better protect that data from getting into the hands of a young person's data, getting into the hands of someone who is maybe does not have their best interest at heart, which is what we've been seeing over the past decade or so.
Mm-hmm. So tell us more about what that looks like, because I think some would say, well, gosh, nothing's free in the world. If if you are not paying for something, then you are the thing that's being sold in some ways.
Mhm.
And so when you look at and I think some people are totally willing to make that trade. Like, yeah, I want Facebook to be free. I want my Instagram to be free. I want Snapchat to be free. But tell us sort of what kind of prompted the Maryland Kids Code, because it's coming in the context of sort of all this information being gathered about everyone, but specifically young people. Is there research to show that that's damaging, or what are you seeing as the promptings of this bill?
Yeah, so this bill first, it was passed this May, I believe, this spring, and 3 weeks ago on October 1st is when it was put into law. But it was first proposed by Delegate Solomon in the Maryland House, who proposed this in the 2023 session. And at this time, this bill did not go through. The first time that he presented it, and it had gone through all the committees, and it did not pass. There were a lot of edits that had to be made to it. And we've had many conversations with Delegate Solomon. He's been very helpful in all of our research. And at the end of the day, the start of this was his own passion for his children, which I think is really admirable that he's going into this with such a foot in the door. He's thinking about his own young children and the world that they'll be growing up in. And he made all the edits to this original bill and everything because it was so important to him that this bill get passed into law for children all around Maryland. And hopefully there's been other states that are following or starting to do similar things. And he's just looking out for children's data and for it to not be sold and manipulated.
Right. It seems, Rebecca, in the ideal dystopian world, right, anybody under 18's phones could not access social media, right? And that seems to be really where this bill wants to focus. Barring that, since that can't happen, right? Because children can access it, parents access it for their children. Children are asked, "Are you 18?" And the answer is, "Sure, I'm 15, but I can count."
What year do I have to be 18?
And I say, well, wait till you're 50. You really want to go backwards, but sure, add ages on. And then they can figure out what date they need to say. And so it's a bit of a joke, right, to be 15 and think you're going to have a difficulty, or 11, as students now tell me, or 9, that students now say, I'm on social media. It's the detriment of then once you're on social media that happens. So I think, to Kramer and Solomon's credit, they realize children are going to access social media. So that is a tidal wave they can't get in front of. But now, once it's crashing to the shore, what can we do to mitigate the buffeting of just constant videos that are coming your way that just draw you in, right? So that those algorithms are people's information is scraped. Tens of thousands of data points are scraped about people. And what does that do in the short and long term for children is really where they're putting a pin on the map in this one for us as Marylanders.
So that seems like a no-brainer. Like, okay, abstinence doesn't work, and so let's put guardrails on it. But tell us, and this is really more of your research, how this, what you think that bills like this, what their net effect is, because I think it's important for listeners to know that Maryland's not the first state that's passed this type of bill. There was a bill out of California. There's legislation or rulemaking in the UK and India that also deals with this. So there's precedent, but what's been the effect of those types of bills?
Do you want to take that one?
Sure, exactly right. So here becomes, right, the interesting follow-up is there's not a lot of follow-up, right? So Maryland or California got shut down pretty quickly on their bill, right? And so they're still mashing about trying to figure out what are these ramifications and implications. Britain is the place where we keep having to come back for our information to see where it has made a difference, what it's done demonstrably. And if I recall our information, so that as soon as even we go online and we're doing a Google search, Google cannot capture our information, right? It's automatically just deleted at the very moment that we're putting in anything sensitive, our URL, our IP addresses, and so forth. So, but we haven't shown any studies that it has any long-term beneficial consequences to what the act was intending to do. It's an act that has really solidly good intentions. It's just watching now to see what happens is the state that we're in, which for us is pretty exciting. I mean, we're in the newness of this, right?
Yep.
We're this little bird that's sitting in the nest. It's just starting to flap its wings. Is it going to take off? Where is it going to land? What will be its successes coming out of this? One of our concerns is that in this bill, it casts a very wide net on all types of media for plenty of people. And that became an interesting conundrum that we found ourselves in while we were doing this for the past 7 months.
Yeah,
Sure.
so to add on to that, so that's kind of the crux of what our project was going to be. When we jumped into this project into our research, we had an idea of what the bill meant, but we really were trying to go into it with an open mind to see what are the consequences of this bill going to be, because it's something that we believe that people should be protected and have a right to protection, particularly with data, because there's so many people have data that's taken that they don't even know is being taken from them. But we also, and this is where we began working with you, Rebecca, and with MDDC, we care a lot about local journalism and local news. We're seeing so many newspapers that are small and regional and local are dying off. They're happening every week, and it's really creating that we're having all these big conglomerate national news sources as are becoming our points of access of information. And all politics is local, and that's what we keep on coming back to that. And we can look at major headlines and big newspapers as much as we want, but at the end of the day, there are so many things that are going to affect our lives directly that without local journalism, we may not be able to have a full education on it. So we were looking at this from the scope of, will this bill directly affect any local journalism or local media outlets and our access to information? And in that, we found that, like Professor Guise-Gerrity said, this bill does cast a wide net, and that is what made us a little nervous in the beginning. But in our conversations, it seems as though one of the points of criticism that the bill received when it was going through in 2023 was just that, and that was one of the edits that they made and the feedback that they took when they were making the bill that then did get passed this spring. Because like we said, we do really care about it. And in our conversations with Delegate Solomon, he was expressing such gratitude for local journalism and how he really values it and protects it. And it's something that he thinks is very important as well. And in our research, we've just been looking at it specifically through that lens. And like Professor Guise-Gerrity said, we're now it's a little exciting. It's definitely nerve-wracking because we don't know exactly what it's going to be. But I can say pretty comfortably, I do think personally that this bill will seek to protect local journalism as best it can. And it was made so with care.
So, and as the person who sort of fought against passage of this bill on local news, and we know the California bill has an injunction on constitutional grounds. I don't know if the Maryland bill will be challenged. It did go into effect in October, but that doesn't necessarily mean it won't be challenged on constitutional grounds. Tell me more about why you think that local journalism is going to be protected under this bill? Because I kind of disagree. So I'm fascinated to hear what you're,
Exactly.
why
Yeah.
you think, how you think.
And it's if I and Kate will speak to this also, but and Jared is funny. He brings up your name all the time, Rebecca.
Oh,
Because
I
he
hope not
respects
in
you
vain.
so much.
He
Not
respects
at
you
all.
so much.
He
No,
respects you so
he really
much,
does.
and he just
Oh, that's
thinks
so sweet. And I'm glad we're in public now. That's great.
yes, it's now official, right? He really does, and his goal was to really protect this. And we think one of the reasons why, because he came to my class about 3 weeks ago and he was a huge hit among students, but he ended up spending all of his time talking just about local politics and how he talks to people in his neighborhood, and people want to know, why is there a new speed bump coming? When are they going to change the traffic lights? So to Kate's point, it's all about local. It's all local, all local, all local. We even did a survey, um, and we can share the data and the information with you. People want local news. They want to know what's happening locally. 42% or 92% of our respondents said they really care deeply about what's happening locally. Not a lot of people source local media, and one of the reasons why is they don't know that it's out there anymore, which is
Right.
troubling and disconcerting. And we suspected that comes from not being able to advertise perhaps as much as local news wants to, and that's a revenue problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could add on to that, I think that I 100%, because I'm also in journalism, so I totally see exactly where the fears are, and we started out on this project really looking directly at those passages of the bill and seeing this could hurt a local newspaper, but we really started to focus on some of the different things that it outlined in terms of the requirements. One of the major requirements is that you have to have $25 million in revenue, which a lot of local journalists and media companies, unless they're owned by a major conglomerate, which there are a lot that are, but there's also plenty that aren't. I know there's one in Cecil County called, I think it's one of the oldest newspapers, like in the...
That would be the Cecil Whig that's
Yeah,
owned by APG.
Right.
The Baltimore Times is one of our few independently owned, but
Yeah.
the Cecil Whig is owned by APG Media, which in aggregate is well over 25 million. Just so that you're
okay.
aware of that.
It's
And I
interesting.
think that's one of the really interesting things for me in terms of working on some of these issues, that the small local paper is not always as small. The newsroom might be very small because they're all sort of, uh, local newsrooms, but they all roll up. And many of these bills, in their quest to kind of get at social media or the big guys, put
Right.
those big revenue tags, thinking like, oh, well, that's not going to affect this, that, or the other. But I wish 25 million went farther than it did, but it is 25 million doesn't take you as far as it used to.
Well,
So
that's yeah.
so it's interesting, and I do feel like a lot of these bills are try and focus on a different type of organization.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yes, right, which is decidedly true. Because when the bill gets talked about, it's taking on, is the David taking on the Goliath of Facebook, right? Or Meta, we should say, right? And TikTok, and then Snapchat to a certain degree, right? It's trying to address the psychological damage that's being done by the invasiveness of social media and how it algorithmically draws our attention, right?
Mhm.
So I will routinely have students sit in my class who can barely keep their eyes open at 10 in the morning talking about, zombie scrolling and doom scrolling. And I was up till 4 a.m. again on TikTok, and I don't even have it. So I always tell them, I don't understand what you're saying. If you could help me out with that, what engages you? But it's night after night after night after night. So we do
And
see.
then have you in your research, because I know you've spent so much of the summer working on this and doing such a great job of kind of beating the bushes on it. It sounds like the jury's still out on a lot of this, because I think we all recognize doom scrolling and being and sort of attention being taken is a big factor. How does data factor in, though? I mean, because if the issue is people spending too much time on social media, how does pooling data affect that? Like, have you been able to kind of figure that out, and if these bills actually are like making a difference?
So that's a
No,
really great question.
That's a great question. And the bill does not address that, right?
Mhm.
I mean, the bill doesn't say you have half an hour on social media every day. That would almost be a nice solution, but your data
Wouldn't
still
that be?
counts.
It just shuts down.
No, right? Just yeah. And so I suspect one of the pieces of that is the longer you're staying online, the more your data they're collecting in terms of your likes, your interest, how long you stay on something, what buttons you push, what attracts you, what you're willing to buy, what you're willing to heart was for somebody who you've never met in your life, who you want to send it to, right? Which is your collection of 30,000 indistinguishable friends, right? And do they like
Mhm.
you? And so, right, this vernacular that we all use now because of them. And so that is what that would be the assumption that we're making, right? So more of you is becoming vulnerable and available the longer you're staying on, the more they keep capturing your attention, the more they can start embedding messages, the more they can start putting in advertising, the more they can turn you into the pawn that they're really aiming to get. And so they're concerned, because one of our concerns was for teachers, right? So if teachers are going to send a seventh grader on to Britannica or onto a local newspaper to look up something that might be considered a sensitive topic, what is that now going to look like, right? And the way that the bill is written, these small and local media companies, they're going to have to be on the look for who is viewing their information. And if they think that you are under 18, which they should somehow be able to figure out, then they need to block you, right? They need to pull you off. And I find, Kate and we find that concerning. So that kind of takes us out of the revenue stream part of it and really just says, well, what sort of information is in fact beneficial? And aside from media sources maybe being biased in an opinion, they tend not to be putting out any information that is just harmfully detrimental to an 11-year-old. So
yeah, and to add on to that really quickly, to going back a little bit to the question that you had mentioned about just how would you kind of were disagreeing a little bit with what I was saying. Not only so you're saying that news sources we're feeling fearful about children on Britannica or local journalism website for school or something, but they specifically outline, and I believe that this was one of the edits that they made from the original bill to the bill that did end up getting passed, is it has to have $25 million in revenue, but it also has to be a site that is reasonably and popularly accessed by children. TikTok is reasonably and very popularly accessed by children. Instagram, same thing. Snapchat, same thing. There are a lot of different social medias. The Baltimore Times is not something that children are going to be reasonably and popularly accessing. And I think that even though that can sound a little bit like a gray area, I do think that is probably the strongest thing that is protecting local journalism. Like we said earlier, it's so upsetting to see local journalism is dying off, and we're seeing newspaper closures every single week. Newspapers wouldn't be closing if children were reasonably and popularly accessing them. So that kind of immediately takes a lot of different news sources kind of out of the mixed bag of the different companies that could be affected by this.
And I think that's where there's probably going to be court cases and dissent around this that really just, I think, and where this gets to be, and we'll just have to see how things work out. This is essentially model legislation that's poised to be in other states, although it has not passed in other states. But, I think articles within arts and features, those are all very timely and attractive to younger populations. I think an argument could be made in a variety of ways to say, oh, that is attractive to children. And Maryland does say that it loves its local media, but not every state is like that. And so essentially, local media is having to go through hoops to pay for the problems of social media. And
Right.
Yeah.
in some states,
Yes.
the attorney general really could be saying, oh, yep, the Washington Post, the New York Times, that's attractive to younger people. Like
Mhm.
New York Times just a couple weeks ago did a great article on Aubrey Plaza, who's, very, maybe not attractive to the 11-year-old set, but is definitely
Sure.
in there in the world. So I think so it sounds like from your research, it you're not it's not quite sure how things are going to play out. Nobody's ever sure, definitely. So in this process, it sounds like you've come to the idea that, when you're doing the checks and balances, that you feel like the goals, even if they haven't been proven yet, of this bill, certain are like the outweigh the efforts or the requirements that this puts on local media. Am I getting that right? Like, because I'm curious about the thinking sort of from the start to the end of the project.
Right. So our first thought was wholesale, the bill is wrong, right? The
Mhm.
bill is far overreaching. The people who are looking at this legislation just didn't do their due diligence, right? To your point, 25 million that's not a lot in revenue. Printing costs, whatever, have taken that up. We did have a tough time getting local news to respond to us, local media respond. So we don't know what their costs are annually. I mean, that became a struggle to find out. And we still, Kate and I still grapple with that piece of the bill. We really kind of bang our heads and think, why did you have to put it in? Why couldn't you have just left local media alone, right? Or make the benchmark higher, right? And so it is the opt-in piece that Delegate Solomon talked about, that your friend, who's great, Coburn talked to us about, right? So that local media can advertise to its subscribers and to people and say, listen, you have to opt in for us to be able to then use your data to tell advertisers and who can then donate to our business, our nonprofit, so we can let you go, right? Other piece, once again, is the nonprofit. If you qualify as a nonprofit, we are not going to come knocking on your door and oversight you as much as we are. Here's an assumption that Kate and I had talked about, is that perhaps local media got swept into this big bill that it is, because it's really quite large and broad, because perhaps the envision is that you could be Meta and you could be TikTok and you could then sort of localize yourself. So you could be local Meta, Baltimore 21212. And now you are a local source of media or entertainment for students and children and people who shouldn't be readily and easily accessing the information because they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to sift through it well enough. And so
I find that so interesting because, and actually, I think there is that idea that, local news and some of the social media platforms, that line of news theoretically could be blurred. So you have, like the neighborhood or the next doors of the world being like, this is what's happening on my block and this is what's happening over here. I feel like as soon as you sign up for Nextdoor, your life is a little bit over because you're just overwhelmed by the number of things.
Yes, exactly right. Which is mostly,
but maybe that's my whole life.
Right. I can't get rid of it.
So Nina and I are in
We're
the
boat,
Nextdoor hell.
Right, please get paper.
But I do, so there's, and this is something that I try and, as a local media proponent, kind of educate people about, is that the social media platforms are not responsible for the content that's posted on social media.
That is correct. Yes.
And news media is, in fact, responsible. So I think I'm really curious, and I have no idea really, but it would be interesting to see if the like if Facebook had or Meta had a 21210 news site, they would be responsible for that content. So you
Right.
can't really have it both ways. You can't say,
Right.
"Oh, I'm here. This is just a platform I've built, and the public says what they want." We don't have any responsibility, and also claim the protections of news media, because they are really two different things. And I think more and more they're getting kind of elided together when there really are some interesting
in this bill.
distinctions.
Yeah. Right. And that's left out of this bill, quite honestly, right? Because media is simply held to a higher standard, right? It has facts and checks, and people are asking questions
and
about
ethics.
Sure,
Journalists follow ethics, and social media does not have to follow that. There's so many differences.
Right. If
you're because they're just people.
They're just chatting, and that's fine. It's a forum for just chatting openly about what you want. Media is not the same thing, right? So we really did struggle with this bill. We're not going to lie. It really is. It's two separate issues. In fact, several issues that they've just conflated and made into one bill.
Yeah. And I think one of my bigger takeaways from this is I'm always hopeful that the legislation that's put into place is going to be a good thing, even legislation that I have doubts for. I hope that they prove me wrong, because I want everyone to be living in a better world.
Right.
We don't know the exact outcomes of this yet. No one can exactly predict the exact outcomes of this. And that, like we mentioned, that's definitely a little scary, but I definitely feel comforted a little bit having talked with Delegate Solomon and Senator Kramer, just hearing the care that went into it, with their care and their passion for it, even though the bill is still very complicated for me to read, and I'm reading it as a active political science student, and I'm going through it, and it's definitely very complicated, but there's that intangible feeling that you have when you talk to someone. If we had spoken with them and they did not seem to have a real stake in the game, and they did not seem to truly really care about it, I would be feeling probably a lot more skeptical than I am. And maybe that I shouldn't be trusting that gut feeling as much as I am. There's probably something to be said for that, but after hearing them speak about it, I do feel as though I trust their work very much. And one of the biggest takeaways that I've had from this project, taking all of the content out of it, I've learned so much about adapting and learning the shifting in opinions that can happen really, really fast. We, like Professor Guise-Gerrity said, we started out very strongly that this was no, and we've really gone back and forth. And that, I think, is a skill that is not as popular and not as practiced as it should be, the ability to, and that's coming from myself. I learned a lot about that from this project that I previously did not really have. I was very, some may say, stuck in my ways about certain things.
At 20 years old.
I know, gosh.
Yeah, I had strong opinions, and I kept those opinions, but I think that since this project, like, one of the bigger takeaways has just been the ability to flip-flop a little bit and have an open mind and look at different perspectives. And at the end of the day, I think that that's probably, like I said, taking all the content out of this, one of the biggest pros of working on this project has definitely been that.
Right.
Well, and I feel like it's great to have a project that you can really, sink your proverbial teeth into and like wrestle with these big issues. I mean, as a philosophy professor, Nina, did that just excite you to sort of see those big picture issues come forward?
They did, Rebecca, very, very much. And that was some of the joy of what Kate and I were able to do, right? And then this summer, I was camping in the library. I was there every single week doing research about just local media nationwide and what it looks like in Britain and in India, and if it's made it, and so what are the intentions? And so constantly, it really was. It's what I live to do. It's why waking up at 3 a.m. with a really good why question is still exciting to me as I become a grandmother. So that's the joy of what this project. So to you, we're incredibly grateful, right? And that was just a serendipitous conversation one afternoon when you were driving home from Annapolis, and we had a conversation. So for that, we're incredibly grateful. But we also think happened in the iterations of this bill, and we do get this from talking specifically to Delegate Solomon, is they tried to put enough of a safety in place so that if you are a local media nonprofit, you have to have a certain amount of revenue, you have to have a certain number of continuous and regular and active users. They try to carve out a space for smaller companies and not make it a burden under the bill for them. That's the part that we want to wait and see play out over the next 5 years, 10 years, to see what that looks like as local media, particularly in the South, continues to shut down, right, in the South and Midwest, and they're now leaning into universities to become their local press, which is really interesting that they're doing this in North Carolina, in Oklahoma, so that journalism students are becoming their local reporters. Good internship, however, right, in terms of the importance, right.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting, that sort of push towards, and like the University of Maryland has a local bureau for news and information that is really helpful. But I think, also kind of thinking about, all right, do we want all of our local journalism to be conducted by students that really, are just like, oh, this could be a good class, or I'm thinking about this, or I'm growing into it.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Right.
and I think but that's a whole other discussion for sure.
Right. Exactly right. Right. I mean, seasoned journalists bring an expertise and an experience that, 21-year-old just simply doesn't have yet. Right. Fair that we can say that. And so, I also worry about polarizing the content that's then put in local news. Right. Do you think it's going to get, called for something? Well, that becomes a problem. Or, in fact, I found this sitting on the table at a cafe when I went in on Saturday. Does the Times now become slightly concerned that there could have material in there that is not appropriate for an 18-year-old or somebody younger to see? So therefore, are we not now printing it, but now we're just leaving it all online? Well, I find that worrisome. It gives us less and less access to it. As our data and research showed, people want, in fact, more and more access to it. 92% of people want more local media. They just don't know where to get it, how to access it, and they're not going to take the time to do it. We were also asking a younger audience. So the fact that you have 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds saying, yes, thumbs up, local media, 92% of us like it. We just don't know where to go get it. So then they just turn to TikTok and Instagram to get their local media, which is, their friends sitting on the couch talking about something.
I'm so interested in that research where if students or sort of the younger set are saying, I want local news, and you can and I haven't Googled local news Baltimore just now, but I would imagine that local news outlets will come up. I wonder if it's more they don't know where to access it because they're all on social media. And news outlets, some have TikTok channels, some have different things, but it feels like, are the way that younger populations are accessing just the world around them is through the filter of social media. And this also, and I think bills like this also make it more difficult because it's not that I would posit if you typed in local news, Baltimore, you would get somebody like the Sun, the Banner, the Baltimore Times, the Afro, the Daily Record, the Baltimore Business Journal, the Baltimore Brew,
City Paper, RIP.
So all sorts of the Baltimore Beat, all sorts of publications are there. And so I think it's interesting and this bill kind of gets to how younger populations, of course, 18 and under, are navigating their world. And whether or not, bills like this actually make a difference, and jury's still out. And whether, that desire for local news means that they will get over the hump of, since social media might not be as friendly to local news with bills like this, if they're willing to kind of look outside their worlds. Or if people in general, it's not just young people, for sure, because it's a challenge across the board. So it sounds like jury's still out.
Right.
So what's the next step for you guys?
Well, well, one thing we were thinking would be a little funny if we had an aggregator app, right? That of just local news from around the country, and you could put in your local zip code, you could put in your school zip code, and it would give you all of the local fun, interesting stories. 36% of students, and this was on Bloomberg last week, 36% of 25-year-old, those who are 25 and younger, go to TikTok and Instagram for all of their news information. That's a freaking large number right there.
And I'd be willing to bet that it's realistically even higher than that. Those are people that are responding to a Bloomberg survey.
Exactly
that
right.
might be,
they'd have to go on Bloomberg to get it.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and it just kind of going back to our earlier conversation of who's responsible for the content. TikTok's not responsible for anything that's posted there. They have no sort of desire or requirement to stand by what's being posted.
They need a VP of ethics. And I'm sure.
I'm not sure it's going to happen with TikTok, but
right. This is
so I really think that these are like huge issues that that do, obviously deserve to be grappled with and are, as you found sort of in your journey in this project, to be a lot more complicated than they might seem on the surface. Because bills like this, you're like, well, who's not for kids? Like, of course we want to protect children. But, the idea of protecting them and at what cost, and is it actually working, and who does it harm as an ancillary, are, I think, all valid questions. So what's next for you all as this bill kind of goes into effect? Are you laying it down because there's other great things to research, or
no, we've become friends.
Yes.
This bill travels with us. Kate and I probably have a pile this high of how many times we've printed the bill, written all over it. Written
and
so
that's
much.
a heavy bill. It's a lot of paper.
Yes. And then we can't read it because we've written so much, and then we
print a new one,
start clean again. We're like, okay, if we had a different opinion, what would it be about this, and looking at this? So
I think the next step for us, so we are so thankful to Loyola. We got this research grant through the Center of Community Service and Justice. And this grant will be kind of finishing up with the materials that we have and sending it over to them and hoping that they give us the stamp of approval on it and that they liked our work that we did. But I think to Professor Guise-Gerrity's point, even after we submit this project to them and say thank you for everything, I think we'll still be following it a lot in our own time and just interested to see the effects of it, because we are really passionate about local journalism. We're also really passionate about these big tech companies having access to our information and what that could mean. So even after we submit our project, I think we'll still be following this and probably texting you a couple times a year.
There's always something happening.
Exactly right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Our yearly dinners at the delicious Mediterranean restaurant.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Our yearly check-in. I know. It will be fascinating. And then we have follow-up conversations with Delegate Solomon coming and with Senator Kramer. So, and then we want to invite you into our classrooms in the spring to talk, because you fit in perfectly with John Stuart Mill, right? This idea of censorship and on liberty. Transferring information this marketplace of ideas. It starts with local journalism. Mm-hmm. That's where conversations happen.
I think at the end of the day, just keeping the conversation rolling is very important. We can't let the conversation die down, because once the conversation dies down about issues like this, then everything else goes down with it.
It does. Right.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for coming to talk to me today. This was terrific, and I really enjoyed hearing sort of the arc of that project. I know it's been a long journey, and I'm so excited to see you guys, come to some conclusions and be ready for the next step.
Thank you so much.
We're great. We can't wait for the next conversation with you, Rebecca. If you call me on a Thursday night at 7, I'll think, oh, here it comes.
Here's something.
Bring it on.
All right, well, it's great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, @mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.